Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Progressive Policy Institute. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me this week is Rob Mather. He's the founder and CEO of Against Malaria Foundation, and this is the fourth episode in our series on effective altruism. Effective altruism is a movement that says when you try to do good, you should try to do good as effectively as you can. Do as much good as possible with the effort that you're putting in, with the money that you're putting in. And it explores some of the ways that we can do that. And people arrive at very different answers for what that might be. And today we're talking with Rob, who founded Against Malaria, something that is often cited as one of the most effective charities in the world at saving people's lives, at preventing human disease and sickness and death. And that's the topic of the episode. How we are trying to fight malaria, why this is important, how it fits as an effective altruist kind of goal, and where we go from here in the global malaria fight. So, Rob, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
So I guess we'll start with kind of the baseline case. And, you know, you've come on the podcast before, and we've talked before several times, but I'd love for you to just lay out for people who aren't familiar with malaria globally and the fight against malaria, what is the work that you do? Or, you know what, I think we should start even simpler. Before we even get into the work that you do, why is malaria such a big problem globally?
It's a big problem because 640,000 people die of malaria every year still, and 70% of those deaths are children under 5, and 250 million people fall sick each year. And if you're sick with malaria, which can put you down for between 1 and 3 weeks, particularly if you're an adult, you can't work, you can't teach, you can't drive, you can't farm, you can't function. So it is a drag on the economy of the locations in which we find malaria, which is in sub-Saharan Africa, or at least that's where 90% of the deaths are. So it's a humanitarian issue and it's an economic issue.
I think the next step then, we've got all these, you know, huge numbers of people dying every year from malaria, and even larger numbers of people getting sick and you know, facing potentially long-term consequences of the disease. Your organization Against Malaria mostly fights malaria with bed nets. Can you talk about why bed nets are considered to be such an effective resource for fighting malaria?
Sure. So bed nets, the humble bed net, as I often refer to it, which costs about $2, is so effective. In fact, it's considered to be the most effective way of stopping the transmission of malaria, is because the malaria-carrying mosquito typically bites between 10 o'clock at night and 2 o'clock in the morning. So if we cover people when they're sleeping, the mosquitoes can't get at people to get a blood meal. That's why they target us. We are particularly attractive as a blood meal to the pregnant female mosquito, actually, who needs a blood meal in order to reproduce. Then we do a huge amount to stop the transmission of malaria. And these days we use what we refer to as long-lasting insecticidal nets, or LLINs. And the long-lasting refers to the insecticide on the net, which is perfectly safe for people lying underneath the net. I remember being told once that a small baby would have to lick about 2 square meters of the net in order to get a mild tummy ache. So you'll understand that the insecticide on the net has gone through decades of process to check that it's okay for human beings. That's extremely important. And because a mosquito doesn't land or doesn't do an aerobatics maneuver through a hole, and I'm afraid the environments in which we distribute these nets, there are often holes and rips and tears that occur over time in these nets. Because a mosquito lands on the netting and then migrates to a hole in order to pass through, and in doing so picks up insecticide, which causes knockdown, knocks the mosquito down and it dies. These nets are incredibly effective, 99% plus effective, even when the net is compromised with holes and rips and tears. So they are an incredibly valuable tool in the fight against malaria.
And how do we know that they are kind of effective? Because when you hear about fighting malaria, you can hear about many different things. You go back in history and, it's people taking quinine or whatever when they were going to malarial regions of the world. You hear about, efforts in the U.S. to kind of like drain certain swamps entirely. And, there's no malaria in the U.S. anymore, but there used to be. And they would do these big public works projects to get rid of certain areas and to get rid of mosquito populations. And you hear about bed nets, certainly. You hear about drugs being developed. You hear about malaria vaccines being developed. I've even heard about like science fiction-y kind of stuff about, we can genetically engineer certain mosquitoes to not reproduce and to be sterile. So why do we consider bed nets in particular like the most effective? What's the evidence around this being more effective than any other thing?
So we'll come back to the science fiction, because our hope is that the science fiction at some point will become science fact. But I'd point to two things. Firstly, there have been a significant body of research, including a number of randomized controlled trials, which arguably are the gold standard of research work, going back 30 years, that have looked at how LLINs perform in certain settings. And that body of research effectively has provided us with the data and the evidence that shows us that these nets, when deployed, simply hung over a sleeping space, are incredibly effective at saving lives and reducing the number of cases of malaria. It used to be that the number that was cited was 160 bed net years. When I first started AMF in 2004, I remember 160 was a number that was particularly interesting to me. 160 bed net years equals one life saved. And you can translate that into, at the time, about 200 to 300 nets distributed was going to equate to one life saved. And here we were talking about incredibly high malaria burden areas. Nowadays, what we would look at is about 1,000 nets distributed, something like that. It equates to one life saved, 1,000 cases of malaria averted. And because we're talking about $4,000 for the cost of distributing those nets and the cost of the nets themselves, those $4,000 also generates about $50,000 of improvement in local GDP. Going back to my earlier point about people being sick, you can't farm, drive, teach, function. If people are now not sick, they can contribute productively to their local economy. The second thing I would say is that the evidence we have from distributing nets is that when you do so, malaria comes down. And that is why over the last 15 years or so, the long-lasting insecticidal net has become the most significant first line of defense, if you like, in preventing malaria, because, of course, prevention is better than treatment. So that's why we at AMF focus our efforts in that direction.
I think it's very interesting to think about your place within kind of the global health community, because there's kind of a first level that's very interesting. And the first level is just, well, this is the most effective thing you can do. Or you can argue about the details, but it's one of the most effective things you can do. And people love to toss around this statistic. And I've heard between $3,000 to $5,000 saves one life and saves, however many people from actually getting malaria in the first place. And you cited the GDP numbers. And I think that's really interesting and important. But I also think that on kind of a deeper level, Against Malaria, along with institutions like GiveWell and other, kind of effective altruist institutions, has really impacted the global health kind of charity space in terms of demanding a certain amount of rigor. I know that, if you went back 30 years and talked about we want to help prevent diseases, people would have good ideas and they'd have really good intentions, but there would not be the same level of rigor and kind of statistical analysis and proof that what they were doing was really helping save lives as there is today. And, maybe even today, the broader community still needs more rigor. But is that something you've seen? Like, do you feel like you've had an influence on charities needing to be more just rigorous and prove their impact? Have you seen any development over the course of the decades that you've been doing this?
Yeah, I think so. I think we've seen, we operate in an environment where we work with partners. We can't do everything on our own, or we certainly don't choose to, because there are other organizations that are extremely well placed to deal with other parts of the distribution of the nets. So, for example, we focus our funding from the public on nets. So, 100% of all of the money that comes to us at AMF from the public buys nets. Not a cent goes in anything else. So it's very sort of direct. It's very pure. We work with partners. Co-funding partners is one example of a set of partners, and they fund the non-net costs. So they fund the shipping and other aspects of registering households, so we know how many nets that go to each household, and paying for the distribution itself. So we work with a variety of organizations that co-fund projects with us. We work with a variety of organizations that are involved in monitoring work. We tend to monitor the living daylights out of the things we do, and we fund that, and we have a set of funders who provide money specifically for that purpose. And what we've seen over the last 10 years in particular, when we've sort of started to hit our stride, if you like, and we've started to do larger distributions, so moving from a few thousand nets when we started. I think our first distribution was 3,000 nets, albeit I think there were 10 lots of that. So 30,000 nets was the first thing we funded. Now we fund millions and tens of millions of nets at a time. And so I think it gives us the, the literal and metaphorical bigger seat at the table in talking with partners about how important it is to, I'd add one word to that list of rigor, analysis, and proof that you mentioned earlier, and that is, perhaps it's implicit in what you were saying, but it's data. And we focus in our discussions with partners in many circumstances on the data. I sometimes, perhaps a little bit flippantly, we say to people, please don't ask us to trust you, because we won't. We also won't ask you to trust us, by the way. Let's just focus on the data. And if we can focus on the data and, importantly, make sure that that data is good, because obviously, garbage in, garbage out, that the data we're collecting is reliable, which is incredibly important, then we underpin a progression towards much more accountable, understandable work. And in our case, that means really understanding that if we fund 1 million nets, what I want to know is that 1 million nets, and my colleagues want to know that 1 million nets get to the people who need them. Because if only 900,000 did, somebody might look at that and say, well, they were 90% of the way there. I would look at that and say that's 100,000 nets that have the potential to protect 180,000 people that haven't got there. That's bad. And so, and each one of those people, each 5 or 6 people, is a family. So it really matters. So we've seen partners embrace more of the operational elements that we are very keen to see, perhaps I should say require, because they're part of a legal agreement in distribution, so that we have the data that allows us to know what has happened.
And when you say partners, just to clarify here, this is like the people who are on the ground doing a lot of the work, because Against Malaria is a small team. You guys have like 10 employees or something in that nature, and so you are not personally going out to many of these African countries and distributing the nets. You're relying on a local nonprofit or a local government to do that, right? Are those the partners you're talking about?
That's right. And so perhaps I can just paint the picture of what a distribution involved in terms of the players. So there are funders of the nets, to put it at its simplest level, and the non-net costs. So that might be us funding the nets. It might be the Global Fund or PMI, the President's Malaria Initiative, based in the US, who are funding the campaign. There are other organizations that provide funding, but those 2 other ones I mentioned are 2 of the biggest. In fact, the biggest funders of nets in the world are the Global Fund first, the American government second, and AMF third. And we work in partnership with these and some other organizations. You have the Ministry of Health in a country that is responsible through a unit within the Ministry of Health called the National Malaria Control Program. And that is, again, typically a small team of people, potentially 10 to 30 people in size. And they're responsible for planning and carrying out a significant logistical exercise in a country that might involve the distribution of 10 million nets over a 4-month period. with a 2.5-year planning runway. And the reason that we work with ministries of health and further down in the chain, if I was to take, you, Jeremiah, and the listeners to a village and a set of villages in Africa, you need the local health workers on the ground involved in this logistical exercise of distributing nets. So you might have a health center of 40 people, and they're dealing with a catchment area of 15 to 20,000 people in a population, in a sub-county perhaps, made up of many hundreds of villages. And perhaps over a period of a week, 15 of those 40 people will spend a week going to every single household in that catchment area and understanding how many sleeping spaces there are, effectively, such that when the distribution then occurs some days, months, weeks later, they know exactly how many nets to give to each household, because that's the recipe for an effective, efficient distribution. Across a country, you need many thousands, if not 10,000 people who are actually visiting households and preparing for the distribution. So that has to involve the nation's health system. And that's why we partner, if you like, with that sort of chain of organizations to get the work done. We then separately fund independent organizations to do monitoring on our behalf, above and beyond the normal data flow of all of the household data flows to us, so we can know exactly what's going on and what the numbers are in particular locations. And so there are another set of people that we work with as partners. And we've seen, therefore, going back to your question, some of these, many of these organizations, many countries adopting this approach. I'd like to say it's a very pragmatic, practical approach of, for example, rather than collecting household data on a piece of paper, so probably about 40 pieces of information. Sounds a lot, but you can put it on paper in under 5 minutes. It's the household head's name, how many people are in the household, how many sleeping spaces, and some other information that is going to underpin the allocation of the nets and the successful distribution. We now work with electronic device data collection, and that's been a process over a number of years of taking ministries of health with us and explaining what we've done in other countries and the issues we've had to deal with to arrive at a successful operational model that means that we can gather millions and millions of pieces of information, often 50 to 100 million pieces of information, in preparation for net distribution. And we gather data incredibly efficiently, very cost effectively, so we can look at it real time. And you can imagine what access to that data, all held highly confidentially, I should add, or securely, how effective that is, or how important that is for planning a campaign and knowing what the numbers are. And when you see anomalies, because we ratio match and we do all sorts of pattern matching on the data that we see sort of in real time, so we can really understand where the data is good and we're happy with it, and where we think, we might need to ask for somebody to go and have another look. And this is all part of being really efficient and accountable with the work we're doing, because fundamentally I'm one of the greatest cynics when it comes to some of this charity work. Perhaps I shouldn't admit that, but I do. And it means that I'm really keen that the work we do focuses on the data.
I think there's probably some punchline there from, world's biggest cynic has saved X number of lives, and I don't know. It is a funny contrast between somebody who does as much very quantifiable good for the world as you've done to describe themselves as such a cynic. But I am really interested and fascinated by the idea of change. And I would love if you have any stories about like specific partners or specific organizations that have changed or that you've seen change over the years in terms of how they use data and how they kind of the standards of proof that they require of themselves. And I'll start out by sharing one with you that you may not be aware of. Are you familiar with Bill Easterly?
No.
So he wrote the Elusive Quest for Growth. He wrote The White Man's Burden. And he has this, background with working with international institutions like the World Bank and the IMF and things like that. And he's very, very pessimistic about, Western nations, rich nations giving money to developing nations, and how it doesn't work. And we actually, had him on the podcast at one point. This was after you and I had talked on the podcast the first time we did it. And I'm talking with him about this, and we're debating back and forth, does all of this work? And he tells me, there is a couple of ways that I've changed my mind. And, like the folks doing malarial bed nets have really convinced me that is a really worthwhile form of foreign aid. And, this guy is basically, his whole career is being a skeptic of foreign aid. And yet with him, you've kind of got him, yeah, you know what, this one's really good. This one I believe in. And this is a guy who professionally doesn't believe in this stuff. So I thought that was a pretty cool moment. And I'm curious if you have other stories of like minds that have been changed or other organizations that have changed in response to this kind of wave of data.
Yeah, we do. I mean, lots. I suppose one I was picking out just because it was something that I was looking at this morning. It's been, our colleagues and I have been speaking about. We have a series of partners in all of the countries that we operate in, who we call our monitoring partners. So no prizes for guessing what these guys do. We approach typically half a dozen organizations in a particular country, and we explain to them what monitoring we would like to do of the net distribution campaign that we're about to fund. And that will include planning monitoring, registration monitoring, and distribution monitoring. In other words, as I mentioned before, we want to monitor all aspects of the process we're funding. We don't just fund nets and then put them on a ship and they arrive in country and we say, good luck, send us a report. That's completely anathema to the way we operate. We really need to be exceptionally close to what's happening through data. And one of the ways we do that, it's not the only way, in fact, the main way we gather data is that we receive data from all of the households that are going to receive nets, and we look at that and analyze it and are aware of it. So that's, in a sense, part of the fundamental aspect of monitoring and accountability. But what we do when we work with our monitoring partners, starting with planning, is we have them, sitting round a table with the Ministry of Health or the National Malaria Control Program team. And we're very keen to point out, and I think we do so successfully, that we're not here to check up on you and cast blame and so on. We're all, imagine it's a circular table. We're all on the same team here. We all want a successful net distribution campaign to happen. We explain to them that what we're looking to do is be aware. We do have some experience now, having operated for 17 years, of what goes on in that planning phase and how critical it is that that correct decisions are made. And we're not there to tell National Malaria Control Program heads and their team what to do, but we can be aware of whether we've got a concern that not enough resource may be being put in place in this area, or the planning is not quite as far advanced as we need it in this area. And so we start by understanding the planning process, and then we look at the registration of households. And then we work with these partners to look at the actual distribution of nets itself, and they independently monitor what's going on without the National Malaria Control Program knowing when they're going to turn up to check up on something and gather data and so on. Now, those monitoring partners, we have moved, I think it's fair to say, from a position where we would say, how much do you think this piece of work, monitoring work, will cost? And they will come back and say, we think that'll cost $30,000. And we might agree that sounds like a reasonable sum, because if we divide the number of households that are going to be checked and so on and so on. Now what we do is we have some significantly tailored, customized systems. None of it's rocket science, but it's really it's a template way of gathering the data we need to gather from our monitoring partners, so that we encourage them to approach the work they're going to do with us in an incredibly rigorous way. So, for example, before we even decide whether we're going to select who we're going to select out of these 6 potential monitoring partners, they fill in an activity-led, cost driver-led budget across 250 line items. So we really know, in the work you're going to do for us, what's it going to cost? How many trucks driving what distance with what cost of fuel and so on. So it's done at an incredibly granular level. And because we have templates for this work to be done, it's not massively onerous for our partners to put this together. what it does is it directs their understanding and exposes it in a collaborative way where they don't have enough understanding and they might need to look more deeply as to how, what's something going to cost, so that they approach the work they're going to do in an analytical, scientific, if you want, way that's, that's crunchy, not soggy. And we know we've taken partners into a position where in other projects that they work on outside of malaria, they now approach things, as somebody put it to us some time ago, we now approach things in an AMF way. And we took that as a great compliment in that, they saw the effectiveness, they enjoyed the way we worked, because it's not us arriving and saying, we want you to do things in this way because we say so. We work with our partners so they come up with a really effective, efficient way of going about their work. That means that when we look at the actual costs that were then associated with a piece of work, it's really easy for us to see as a team, as a collective team with our monitoring partners, what costs more, what costs less, what can we do better next time, how do we get that to be more efficient. And so when we're on to the next bit of monitoring with them in the next year, it's not costing $30,000, it's costing $23,000, because we've all worked out that we've been very scientific about how we've managed things. Now, for some of your listeners, maybe there will be the comment, well, that doesn't sound like rocket science, surely everybody's doing that anyway. But it's not the case. And in fact, if I go back 10 years or so, it was infrequently the case. So that sort of rigor we've seen being adopted by our partners, and we've seen ministries of health adopt our approach in parts of the country where we're not working with them. So if we're funding 50% of the nets for a country, we have certain data requirements and procedural requirements, all focused on delivering as many nets as possible to the right people. And we're talking 99 point something percent, sort of very high numbers, us being aware of it through data and so on. And what we found is, though some of those mechanisms are new to people we're working with, and indeed might attract a cost. So there's an additional cost there. Of course, when you've got an additional cost, the question is it worth spending that additional money? And we would like to believe that by now, in most circumstances, we only suggest an additional amount of money is spent because it's going to deliver significant value, like really understanding where the nets are going. And we've seen that ministries of health choose to adopt AMF policies in other parts of their country. And so that's obviously very rewarding, because they genuinely believe, because at that point it really is a choice for them, that some of the mechanisms that we're working on together are effective. So yeah, we've seen adoption of we've seen people sort of get it in terms of, if we don't gather the data, we can't be accountable.
You and I first spoke in 2018, I think, or maybe 2017. The first podcast we did together was in, I think, December 2018. And I've just seen this wave. I think the wave was already underway at that point, but I've seen this wave of kind of appreciation for the empirical side of these things. And it's beyond just, malaria, and it's kind of filtering into a lot of other areas as well. Like I think about like the 2019 Nobel Prize in Economics went to Duflo and Banerjee and Kramer. And basically what their work was just, field work in kind of emphasizing the use of randomized controlled trials and field experiments in kind of in developmental policy. We can give it, to put it in terms of bed nets, we can give bed nets to this one area and this other area doesn't end up getting them. And we look at what happens and what's the difference. And, I just think it's interesting how you guys have been positioned in that wave of kind of empiricism that's hit development and charity. Now, because we are empirically minded, we've got to always reference ourselves back to the numbers. When we spoke in 2018, it was a very kind of optimistic time, I think, in the malaria space. Malaria deaths were trending down and have been trending downwards for decades. It seemed like we were really making a lot of progress. But since then, it seems like we've lost some of that progress, especially in 2020, which obviously was a very unusual year. In 2020, the world saw a jump in malarial deaths. And I don't know what the numbers look like for 2021, but I wouldn't be surprised if the jump had continued. So I'm curious, do you know, like, what would you attribute this jump in malarial deaths in 2020 and kind of the lack of progress? Is that just because of COVID? If it's because of COVID, are there like specific reasons that COVID caused this to happen? Why have we kind of stalled out in that progress against malaria?
What you may be referring to is the number of deaths that's reported now by the WHO annually stands at 640,000. And that number was first mentioned about a year ago, I think. So we're talking, let's say 2021. Before that, the number that was mentioned was 450,000 deaths. And the reason for the jump is because the WHO recalibrated their numbers and said, we've been undercalling it for a number of years. I think that's something that a number of us had felt for quite some time, that the 450,000 number was undercalling it, but it's very difficult to have proof for that because malaria data is notoriously noisy. So that could be, if that's what you're referring to, then that's a recalibration. But I think the wider point you make is a good one, or is an accurate one, in that for the last 3 or so years, the word that I think we should use, unfortunately, for malaria cases is plateaued. It's not continued its decline, as we saw in a 15-year period prior to that, where the number of deaths from malaria was reduced by 60%. And so fantastic success over that period. Not complete success, because still you've got, hundreds of thousands of people dying. But at a national health level, if you're reducing over that period of time deaths by 60%, for a disease like malaria that is particularly difficult to shift. Half of the people that have ever lived have died from malaria. So research tells us. So it's a knotty problem. So the plateauing has occurred, I think, for a series of reasons. It's occurred through lack of funding. One of the pictures I can perhaps paint when we think about the fight against malaria is we are marching down a conveyor belt that's moving against us. And defeating malaria, having no malaria effectively, or very, very low levels, is equivalent to reaching the end of that conveyor belt. Now, the good news is we can see the end of that conveyor belt. We don't quite know how far away it is, but we can see there's an end to it. In a way that we don't quite see the end of the conveyor belt for tuberculosis or some other problems that are particularly, difficult to shift. Now, we keep making progress down that conveyor belt if we have, amongst other things, enough funding that is used effectively. So I'm not just saying it's about funding. I'm saying it's about funding and its effective use. And I think that second point is really important. I'm very happy to explore that if we have time. If funding dries up in certain areas or it's not sufficient, you tend to slow down or even stop on that conveyor belt. And within 18 months, 2 years, that conveyor belt will take you back, or that conveyor belt will take you back to where you were 2 years ago. So let's put it at a sort of more micro level. Let's imagine a village that's got 700 people. It's a real village in the West Nile region of Uganda. And the village chief is a man called Mohammed. And I happened to have a conversation with him in an office, in a Red Cross office. They were our distribution partner at the time. And we were about to distribute 50,000 nets that would cover his part of the world, including his village. And every sleeping space was going to be covered. And I had a very pleasant conversation with him, with Mohammed, for 5 minutes or so. Quite by accident that he was there. I was talking to the lead at the Red Cross. And we exchanged a few minutes on the phone, and that was the end of that for the time being. We distributed nets. And by the way, the data we had for his village was that in the previous month, they had 357 cases of malaria. mostly in children, relatively few people with multiple cases. So almost half the village had gone down in the previous month with malaria. It was the rainy season, it was bad. But I mean, imagine what that does to a village in terms of its ability to function. 6 months later, I had an email that arrived because Mohammed walked 6 kilometers back to that Red Cross office, and he wrote me an email that said, "Dear Rob, malaria doesn't exist in my village anymore, Mohammed." And that was, I sort of slightly choke up at that now because it's what we're here to do, is to move malaria out of villages like that and get to the point where people are under nets and and they can live what we take for granted by going out the front door and getting on with our day each day. Now, if you find that those nets wear out, because nets last for about 3 years, and you find that in year 3 you've only got 70% of the population covered, and so you've now got people open and able to be bitten by these malaria-carrying mosquitoes. And perhaps they don't get nets in the 4th year because there just isn't enough money to do all of the villages. What happens is the infected blood pool, the number of people with malaria parasites in them, increases. So a non-malaria-carrying mosquito bites an infected person and is now a vector for malaria, and can pass it on to somebody else. And so within 18 months, if you like, or within that 4th year, you suddenly get to the point where malaria is resurging again. That analogy of you've gone back on the conveyor belt. And so we must keep marching forward on that conveyor belt. And that means money and well-directed money. It's not the only thing, because there are other, there are probably about 10 pieces, only 10 pieces in the jigsaw puzzle that is the solution to malaria. One of them is money. Another one is artemisinin and combination therapy, in other words, ACTs. So those are the drugs you take if you get malaria that can clear it out of your body. Nets is another part, and there are other elements, in that malaria picture. So, lack of funding. There are, in a sense, a whole series of other factors that have contributed. So you've got countries that have, been riven with strife and, fighting, and that means that, provinces, don't get any support, and so the nets just don't arrive, and so we're in that sort of village situation where malaria is going to resurge again. We've had a new adversary on the battlefield, if I can use that analogy, and that's something that Darwin always warned us was going to be the case. Survival of the fittest means that there are species of mosquito that now are resistant to the insecticide we use on the nets. Now, it's not sort of game over, far from it. It's a much more subtle problem, but you have, perhaps I could take a second just talk about there being about 3,000 species of mosquito. We're only worried about 40 of them. 40 species are vectors for malaria. So we're not worried about 2,960 other species of mosquito. Of those 40 species, there are 5 or 6 that are particularly nasty, and they're the problem species of mosquito. And within those 6 species, there are pockets that jump up because certain changes and mutations means that particular groupings of some species of mosquito become resistant to the insecticide on the net. And that means that we have to develop new products. So there is a new type of net called a PBO net. PBO stands for piperonyl butoxide. And that is a chemical, we call it a synergist, which we add onto the net. And when the mosquito lands on the net, as I mentioned before, it picks up this PBO through its feet. And in a sense, it switches off the resistance mechanism in that mosquito, which means that the insecticide is then back in the game and effective and can knock down the mosquito. So there's product development that's occurring. But that product development inevitably lags the thing it's trying to deal with. And so over the last few years, we've seen a number of factors, money, difficulty getting to areas, insecticide resistance, and some other factors that have meant that we've plateaued. I think we're going to go into a phase where as long as we can bring in money, and that's the battle that, we try and address every day so that we can fund as many nets as we can and not leave gaps and populations uncovered, We've got a very interesting pipeline of new types of nets tweaked, if you like, in terms of the recipe that's on them. And remember, these nets have to go through, and the insecticide and the chemicals on them have to be, rigorously tested and approved by the WHO before they can be deployed. And we will not deploy any net that the WHO doesn't approve. So we've gone through a tricky period, and I'm hoping that the next period is not going to be tricky. Money is going to be part of that situation, though.
Well, it seems like such a, arms race, I would almost say, where you're trying to develop different, or not you specifically, but, the malaria community is trying to develop better bed nets with different kind of chemical formulations, but the mosquitoes are adapting to the different chemicals. And then you've got the whole problem, as you described, even if we totally eradicate malaria in a specific area, if, 3 years down the line, we're not refreshing those bed nets, then malaria might creep its way back in. And because it's a, highly infectious disease that spreads fairly quickly, 1 year of inattention can kind of put you back to ground zero. And I guess that's the insidious nature of, infectious disease, is that eventually you're going to have to eradicate all of it, or else it will come back, time and time again. And I guess that leads me to the next question, which is, is there a path to kind of complete eradication that you can see moving forward? Because otherwise, if we're just holding the tide back, that's better than letting it, be rampant. But it does mean that we're just going to continually have people dying of this in huge numbers forever, unless we can, eradicate it somehow.
The answer to your question is yes. I'm pleased to say, we can get to a point where we have either eradicated or nearly eradicated malaria. We have to be careful on a scientific, basis as to what we mean by eradication. I mean, smallpox has been eradicated; it's gone. We don't necessarily have to have eradication for us to, progress to a, very different situation than the one we find ourselves in at the moment. For example, in 1969, the Netherlands had an awful lot of malaria. Canals, fantastic places potentially for stagnant water, which are breeding grounds for mosquitoes. But you don't get malaria in the Netherlands now. So obviously that's moved to a much better circumstance. Sri Lanka is that teardrop-shaped island that hangs off the bottom of India. And in 2017, it was declared malaria-free, which was fantastic. And the reason it was declared malaria-free is that for the prior 3 years, 2014, 15 and 16, there were no native cases of malaria. Malaria had been eradicated from Sri Lanka. Now, that's not to say that somebody can't get off a plane who is infected with malaria, having visited, a malarious area. And there are mosquitoes in Sri Lanka, and one might bite that individual and pass on malaria to somebody else. But practically speaking, what happens if somebody in that environment now in Sri Lanka contracts malaria, because you've not got a health system that's spending 40% of its money on dealing with malaria, it's effectively spending none. It has a much better health system for detecting those occasional cases, and they're dealt with very quickly. And so you remove, if I can put it this way, the infected blood pool very quickly. And therefore, any mosquito biting, which as we all know, hopefully just causes an annoying itch, now does just that and doesn't do anything worse. A mosquito has a 2-kilometer fly zone, typically. So again, if we picture that village that we're in the middle of Africa somewhere, if you put bed nets over every sleeping space, you remove areas of stagnant water, you've got enough supplies of ACTs, those drugs that if you contract malaria, you can take a 3-day course and it can flush the parasite from your body, and it might take you between a week and 3 weeks to recover. And you can be pretty sick in the meantime, by the way. People I've met have said too frequently for it to be just the occasional comment, when I had malaria, I just wanted to die. So you feel pretty awful when you've got malaria. It's an understatement. But if you are in a village where you're really removing malaria, so when Mohammed said there were 357 cases of malaria, The month before he came to me, there were 7 cases of malaria. The next month there were none, the next month there were none, the next month there were none, and he walked to the Red Cross office. You can get to the point where you eradicate malaria in that village. Now, your point was obviously a very good one, and that is, yeah, but if there are mosquitoes 15 kilometers away and then 13, 11, and 9, they can come back in and infect that area, absolutely. And so the importance in marching that and that conveyor belt is pushing that concentric, circle of no malaria beyond that village to 20 villages, to 50 villages, to the sub-county, to the county.
If I may, you could almost use like a wartime analogy, that there's like a front line and you don't want anything to breach the front line of your war, like the Soviets and the Nazis, you can imagine, where there's a whole battle line. One side is the good guys, one side is the bad guys. Maybe in that particular analogy, both sides are the bad guys. I don't know, but
well, I won't get drawn into politics.
But you're basically saying there's a clean side and there's a malarial side, and it's you want to have this kind of don't let malaria breach into the clean area. Kind of like if I grew up in the American South, yeah. And the American South is obviously malaria free right now, but 100 years ago, it definitely had a lot of malaria, and it took a lot of work to get it out. And you're saying kind of narrow it in, pin it in, don't let it escape its confines, and then just kind of gradually squeeze it, that kind of thing?
I think that's one way of looking at it. I think perhaps the way going back to this infected blood pool idea of, in your village of 700 people, how many people have actually got malaria parasites in them, such that if they were bitten, that mosquito could pass it on, that doesn't have malaria parasites in the mosquito, can bite that person and pass it on. What you want to do is to keep lowering the number, that infected blood pool, lowering the number of people, so there are fewer and fewer people that have malaria. And it is a pathway. You don't go from, a sub-county that's had 100 deaths and, X thousand cases of malaria. You don't switch it off overnight. And from one year you have malaria and the next year you don't. What happens is you have less malaria the next year and fewer people being infected, and then the subsequent year, less malaria and fewer people being infected, such that if you move forward those 3 years, you're finding that there are fewer people being requiring ACT drugs, and therefore less money that is going in that particular area. Malaria is now not the norm. It's starting to become more unusual, and therefore it's picked up more quickly. Because malaria presents with a fever and a variety of things that overlap with flus and other illnesses. But if you've got less of malaria around, then you're more able to deal with it quickly. Hence, in your neighborhood, if somebody tipped up with malaria and went to the local hospital, through blood slide diagnosis was shown to have malaria, they wouldn't necessarily be isolated because they're perhaps not at risk of having, being bitten by a mosquito, but they would be probably told to stay inside and take the 3-day course of drugs and you'll be fine. You've quashed it. So it's more just moving down all the time over the years. And of course, what we're trying to do is to move down the numbers as fast as we can. And I'm afraid there is one currency that is hugely important in that fight, and it is money. Because if we don't have the money, we can't buy the nets. And the second element, as I've alluded to earlier, is the wise spending of that money, which means spending it on the right things, monitoring that what you're spending it on is actually working, and nets are being delivered and so on. At the end of the day, it's not complicated what we're trying to do, but there is a pathway that takes us from malaria being out of control, where it is in many African countries right now, but really good progress is being made, to under control. And that's that first phase, if you like, or transition. And then the second transition is from under control to elimination, or near elimination, so that it's not such a drain on health budgets. It's relatively infrequent. And actually, we could probably live with, some low level of malaria because we can jump on it when it occurs, but bit whack-a-mole, it keeps appearing. And maybe then a few years down the line, we then get to elimination. So positive answer to your question. can we head towards elimination? Yes, but it's not going to be in the next few years. It's probably, I don't know what the number is, Jeremiah, but it's probably 15 to 20 years away. And that's well within our lifetime, and that's doable. And there are going to be a number of tools, including the ones we're using today, and potentially some new tools that are going to be required for that. But whilst we don't have those new tools yet, one of the principal things we can do is have people sleep under a net.
Well, let's talk about some of the new tools, because we're doing this episode as a part of a series on effective altruism. We've talked to a lot of really interesting people working on animal welfare, working on kind of global catastrophic risk from nuclear war and bioweapons and things like that. And obviously this is kind of a long-time favorite of many people in the effective altruism community. But one thing that EA people love to do is to come up with hypothetical scenarios and arguments about, well, this one thing is really good, but if you did this other thing, it would be even better. And so I can imagine some people saying, well, bed nets are good, but really where we should be focusing our money is something like, what I called the science fiction stuff earlier. We need to genetically engineer mosquitoes that are sterile, and we'll just end up wiping out the mosquito populations that way. Or, we should be focusing on a vaccine. I'm not an expert in this area, but I've heard about vaccines that are underway or that are being tested, and I don't know how effective they might be. So do you think there's a case for, say some billionaire comes along and says, I want to drop $1 billion into funding malaria. Should I be promoting this vaccine? Should I put this into genetic engineering? What do we know about some of these more moonshot ideas as opposed to kind of the more, I don't want to say boring, but almost the more standard playbook at this point, which involves let's put a bunch of malaria nets out there?
Sure. Well, let's focus on sort of what we know at the moment about vaccines. And we're very familiar, given what we've all been through, arguably are still going through with COVID, that vaccines really can, help, or put another way, can work. I mean, if we go back to, the polio vaccine of a number of decades ago, scientists came up with a vaccine for polio. The good news about that particular vaccine was it was 100% effective for 100% of the people, and operationally it required one dose without cold chain logistics, so it could be transported without significant refrigerant, etc. And it was a very effective way of dealing with polio. We're not quite there yet, and we've got a bit of a way to go in several countries. And the Rotary Foundation, Rotary globally have done a fantastic job. The Gates Foundation have put funds in, and there are people supporting that sort of thing. So there's precedent with polio, there's precedent with rapid movement. With a COVID vaccine, remember that COVID is a virus, and we have many examples of vaccines for viruses. Malaria is a parasite. That's different from a virus. It's different from a bacterium. And so we've never had in our history a vaccine for a parasite. So when in recent times, in the last 4 or 5 years, a number of researchers and scientists who've been working on a vaccine for malaria have come up with one vaccine and now a second vaccine, that has been remarkable progress. I mean, fantastic science. Unfortunately, those particular vaccines are not quite there yet in terms of being, the silver bullet. I mean, they're not quite the bullet, let alone the silver bullet. They are an interesting addition to the toolbox, but because in their particular cases, efficacy is 30%, and for a certain group of people, the under fives, and they require multiple injections, a month apart or a week apart. It's not the answer, I'm afraid, and therefore we're not in a position where a vaccine has been found and that is the solution to malaria. But it's quite possible it might be in the future, and so the research work and the development work, if you like, those same scientists and other scientists standing on their shoulders, hopefully will come up with something. I'm keeping my fingers crossed that the scientists are going to come up with a vaccine that can be a significant part of helping defeat malaria. Now, I mentioned there are 5 malaria parasites. There are, in fact, I mentioned that there were 5 or 6 species of mosquito that are particularly bad. I don't think I remember mentioned 5 malaria parasites. There are a number of different parasites, and so it's likely that one vaccine will not fix all. So it's going to be a complicated road. But a vaccine at some point could play a really important part in just reducing malaria. But we're not there yet. This particular vaccine that's been deployed been trialed over a number of years and deployed in some countries, is protecting people and doing good. But always the question we have to face is, where should we be putting our money? And at the moment, it's not a question of piling in, it seems, billions and billions of dollars into the vaccine, because that's going to be the solution. Unfortunately, the numbers don't work for us that way. So vaccines have a future, I hope, in malaria control. You also mentioned effectively gene drive technology, driving changes in the gene. And some of your listeners will be familiar with something called CRISPR, CRISPR, and Cas9. They're 2 particular techniques that, again, some pretty amazing scientists have developed. And it's the way I like to describe it is, imagine taking that double helix gene that we're all familiar with, and in the past, when we wanted to make a change in that gene, you'd sort of metaphorically throw a hand grenade at it, and you would, change bits that you wanted to change, but you'd also change bits you didn't want to change, and so there was some collateral damage. What we can now do, metaphorically speaking, through CRISPR and Cas9 is take a pair of scissors and cut out a base pair and replace it with another one and make an incredibly surgical change. And that has been an extraordinary development in the last 6 or 7 years, I think, that allows us to potentially do gene editing. Now, is there then a future in which a particular mosquito will be gene edited in order for, as you mentioned, it to be effectively sterilized? You only produce males of the species or females of the species, and that species or that subspecies, dies out. I think I would have to nail my colours to the mast and say, whilst I'm always open to receive, further information as to, how the chain effects might occur here, I think I come from a position that if somebody said to me, we're going to take out one of these 5 nasty species of mosquito that is a main transmitter or vector of malaria, and we're literally going to wipe it out, that sounds pretty good to me, because I can imagine how many lives will now not be lost, albeit clearly a move like that or a maneuver like that will have to go through a process where we have to understand, what are the consequences of that. But where I sit at the moment, I think that sounds pretty appealing, particularly because if there are, many thousands of other species of mosquito, will we really miss one that causes such damage? My current thinking is I don't think so.
My goal is just to genetically engineer super mosquitoes. That's what I want. So I want Jurassic Park mosquitoes.
Well,
the faster we can get there, the better.
Well, now you are in science fiction, so I'm going to drag us back to what I hope will become science fact. And therefore, on a serious note, we have a number of these tools that could be what's frequently called a silver bullet. It really is an amazing addition to the toolbox that fix things. Now, at that point, and I would love that to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen tomorrow. And some people I've spoken to in this area who are lead researchers in this area, last time I spoke to somebody was probably about 6 months ago, said we're maybe 7 to 10 years away of coming up with something that we can perform testing on in the malaria area. Now, I would love to be contradicted and that number is 2 years away or 4 years away, but that's my latest information. It says to me that it's not going to be in the next 4 or 5 years that we're going to have an ability to roll out a vaccine or a gene drive solution to malaria. And therefore, in the meantime, we come back to nets and the other things that we can do against malaria. In a sense, we could broadly solve malaria with the tools we've got right now. If everybody slept under a net, and you really limited the gaps, you'd go a long way to driving malaria down more quickly. But unfortunately, the funding isn't there for that.
Well, let me ask you about that then, because we're coming up on time soon. I'm going to try not to keep our listeners here too much longer, but the funding is something that I think is interesting because looking at this through an effective altruist lens, they often talk about three things. They talk about scale. We want to address problems that are really, really big problems. They talk about tractability. We want to address problems where we can make a big difference. It's a big problem, and what we do can actually make a big difference. And I think the evidence is really, really strong against malaria, and the whole idea of malarial bed nets is that it's a really big problem. You can make a big difference for not a lot of money. But the third thing they talk about a lot is neglectedness. And, they don't want to typically fund things that are already getting huge amounts of money where, the money's already being efficiently spent and like all the good that can be done is already being done. So let's talk about neglectedness and kind of the need for additional funding in malaria. What do you think is an estimate of like what would the malaria nonprofit community, whether that's you guys, whether it's the US government or the other nonprofits who work here who fund bed nets, what is actually needed in order to really solve the problem if our final goal is like we want to eradicate malaria over the next 15 to 20 years? How much money does it actually require? And how much is there right now? Like, what is the gap as you see it?
So we would need somewhere of the order of $4 to $5 billion a year only, I would add to that, in order over the next 10 years, so that's 40 to 50 billion over 10 years, to bring malaria under control in most parts of the world. Currently, we have 2.5 billion. So I would replace the word neglectedness or neglected in that malaria isn't neglected. It's getting, hundreds of millions of dollars. I suppose the relevant question is there a verifiable funding gap such that if that funding gap were to be filled, the impact of that funding would be significant? And the answer to that question, in my view, and I think in everybody's view, is unequivocally yes. So, I can speak obviously more for our own organization. We have a funding gap right now, or if I project for the next sort of 3 or 4 months in terms of what we're liable to be able to sort of allocate, it would be anywhere between $300 and $500 million. That's just us. Because what's likely to happen, and I'm here referring to the 2024, 25, 26 period, the gap in funding in each sort of 3-year period over the previous 3-year periods has been between $500 and $800 million. There's great fear that it's going to be even larger this time around in terms of the funding for nets and non-net costs. So that's just the nets and non-net cost bit of malaria control. That's not the extra money that's needed for ACTs, the drugs, for rapid diagnostic testing kits, RDTKs, and other things. So at a high level, we've got a $5 billion a year problem that's only getting $2.5 billion. As a result of that, a significant number of people are falling sick and dying and not getting the basic protection they need. And we need to find a way of filling that gap against a backdrop of other diseases that require lots of other money and global pandemics and wars and various things and economic hardship. And so you see it's a difficult time. So what people like me and other colleagues in the malaria area have to do is to patiently make the case of how the money that might be entrusted to us can be used. And over the last few years, AMF's gone through tens of millions of dollars a year. To the last couple of years, we're north of $100 million a year. But from my preceding comment, you can see that we can take an awful lot more. And there's a direct line between that money, buying nets, protecting people when they sleep at night, and reducing these mortality and morbidity numbers and driving them down. So that's what keeps me busy.
Well, I hope that you stay very, very busy. I remember the first time we talked, I think you still only had 3 people working at Against Malaria, and you were very proud of that fact, of how, you ran a very tight ship. And, these days you guys have expanded. I think it's probably would not be possible to do, 9 figures, hundreds of millions with only 3 people. I hope that you have to expand again, even though I know that you've never been someone who wants like lots of bureaucracy and infrastructure. I hope you guys have to keep expanding, and it's like the worst problem you have is that you can't grow fast enough. So as we come up on time, I'm going to ask the traditional final question that we always ask here, and that is, what can people do to learn more? If they are fascinated by what we've been talking about, or if they just want to do their own research, they want to learn more about Against Malaria, they want to learn more about bed nets or the general problem of malaria in the world, is there anything that you would recommend as further reading? And this could be blogs, books, somebody who's good to follow on Twitter even, who talks about this a lot. Anything that you would think of as a good resource?
So the simplest thing I would do is type malaria into your favorite local search engine and click on the links that appeal to you. Wikipedia does a pretty good job of, giving you a 101 of, malaria, what is it? If people want to go further than that, obviously you can branch off in many different directions to, different organizations. If people want to understand more about what we do and how we do it, we're at againstmalaria.com. So those are 2 suggestions for you.
All right. Well, as I said, I hope you guys continue to grow. I hope that funding gap continues to shrink. And I certainly will be watching it myself. I know I've run charity drives for AMF. For anyone listening, I highly, highly recommend it personally. I think it's a fantastic charity, and it has my full endorsement. So I want to say, Rob Mather, thank you for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you.